The African continent is currently in a debt crisis. Hi, my name is Khanyi Tshabalala and I am the founder of Seize the Light Foundation. On today's segment, I'm going to be discussing what are some of the factors that may have contributed to the Africa debt crisis. As a point of departure, I'm going to be rewinding and taking it all the way back to last year, November, where I attended the G20 in South Africa. So I attended the G20 Social Summit, and I guess you're now wondering who attends the G20 Social Summit. So you have your heads of state, members of parliament, civil society members like myself, those working in non-profit organizations, interested stakeholders, and also ordinary citizens. I think that South Africa may have been one of the only countries to actually invite ordinary citizens to a platform like the G20. And I think that that's symbolic because at the end of the day, as an elected official, it's just a recognition that you are representing broader interests that may sometimes be forgotten. And I think with where we are geopolitically, it may sometimes feel as though the interests of ordinary people aren't necessarily being represented. I must say that in preparing for this segment, I was already reflecting upon my time at the summit and just thinking around how there was already this sense that deglobalization was already at the forefront of most people's minds. I think that people that were in attendance and conversations that I'd had with various people were of the view that countries need to take autonomy over their own development and that certain countries and certain regions required bespoke developmental plans because it's obvious, I think, anybody analyzing the development of countries across the globe can see that countries have not developed at the same rate. And as concerning as that is, and there's been many measures put in place over the past couple of years, I think even decades, if I'm honest, and that's embarrassing to say, to actually address the inequality across the globe. But I think it's getting more and more obvious, even to the ordinary citizen, that those methods of redress or trying to, or equalization rather, aren't really as effective as they should be. So I think if you think back to the time of the G20 and what was being said, we were we were hearing that South Africa was accused of being of hosting a G100, and I found that those kind of comments interesting. Why would that be a problem? But again, I think in answering that question, we would have to go all the way back to the Berlin Conference in the context of the African continent, or we would then have to go to the establishment of global bodies like the UN after World War II. I think at those points in history, you had more of a sense that countries wanted to come together to form global bodies and global I mean, can we call them economic pods? I guess we can. And I was reluctant to say that because of just how the funds in these pots were allocated and at what cost. To me, it's interesting, but okay, let's call it that for now. You had a sense that people wanted to move together and that development was going to happen for all countries, but the results obviously speak for themselves. The continent is in a debt crisis. Interestingly, I'm not sure if we look at the countries that were perceived to be ahead, developed, their development has stagnated. I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to be going into the specificities and your GDP metrics and so on and so forth. However, I just think I go based on what is the lived experience of what is lived experience telling us, what are people on the ground actually saying about how have their lives changed. So yeah, I think in summary, my time at the G20 was insightful because I realized that conversations had in those spaces maybe don't trickle down to the ordinary citizen in the way that they should be, But I think for me, having bespoke strategies for particular countries in particular regions, depending on obviously their population growth, industry, and economic opportunity is important. I don't think that you can just use one playbook and deploy that across the globe generally. And I think that that's been one of the biggest disadvantages that the continent has experienced to date, because you've got global institutions who have accumulated global funds, but the allocation of these global funds are being dictated. And I mean, dictated is probably a harsh word to use, but you would think who crystallizes what are going to be the thematic areas of economic investment. These are questions that are now coming to the forefront. And I think for me, it's been interesting that even the ordinary citizen is now concerning themselves with where is the money going? Because at the end of the day, we're paying tax, and this tax money is not necessarily being distributed into healthcare, into education, into infrastructure. So that's raising alarm bells. I think that can we say that globalization is over is a critical question. And as I say, remarks and critiques coming out of the G20 around the hosting of a G100, and even just I would say, even just the sentiment towards maybe not having full representation of all countries, it was sort of indicating that you do still have bigger global players who have that dominating voice. And those dominating voices are very influential. Of course, we know that, if you look at the UN, for example, and the Security Council, you've had those members on the Security Council since the UN was formed. That, from a civil society perspective, has always been highly contentious. But I will also speak to how the UN structures are changing and what we're seeing in the civil society space, because that becomes important to how public funds are being invested. Do I still think that those seven hold influence? I don't, as I say, based on my time at the G20 and the sentiment I got on the ground, I don't necessarily think so. I think that people are getting restless. I don't think that they're folding their arms and waiting for these bigger sort of superpowers to make decisions and direct capital. I think that people are getting restless and they want to be involved and understand where are the taxes going, and how is it being used to benefit the lives of ordinary people. So I think this is a good time for me to discuss briefly the history of philanthropy on the continent, because I think when we're talking money, I talk about capital being deployed through those global funds. And then we've also got philanthropic capital. I'm leaving private capital for now. Philanthropic capital has been deployed onto the continent, I would say, since just after Berlin World War II times. Of course, we know that philanthropy on the continent has been highly controversial. I mean, look at the state of the continent, right? I don't think anybody can analyze it and think philanthropy has worked. It really hasn't. Things are going to change when it comes to philanthropy. And I don't want to mention the particular superpower, but in how they've already pulled back aid, you're already beginning to see that was an act of deglobalization. We're returning to our markets. We're also doing more due diligence as to how is this money being spent. And that's a conversation for the emergence of impact investing, because, anybody who comes into, I think, a space where you're being told that, money is being deployed to advance certain causes. If you look at that particular community and see that, well, you're saying there's a feeding scheme people are probably being fed 2 or 3 times a week, but what happens in between that? And also, how are you determining the kind of food that you're feeding the people? It really you can really drill down to the granularity, but I guess the bigger question would be, why do the people need the food in the first place? Like, why are they hungry? So philanthropic capital is also starting to ask more questions, because you've had high network individuals, family offices, pour money into the continent, and they haven't necessarily seen that ROI. If they saw the ROI, the continent wouldn't look how it looks. I think that things would look quite different. It would have been developing at a much faster rate than what we're seeing. So I think there's a lot of various stakeholders, both public and private, that are asking more questions as to how is this capital actually being spent. So now there's going to be sort of like a heightened level of scrutiny when it comes to the deployment of capital on the continent. Because on the one side, you've got these loans that went in, and without getting too into the nitty-gritty of the arrangements of those loans and who signed on behalf of them, I would just summarize that to say the continent has been in a neoliberal state, and many of those loans had been taken. We don't know whether it was voluntarily or whether there was a firmer hand. But what we do know is that we were told that in terms of the global funds, everybody's going to develop, yet it seems like some countries went ahead and then other countries have lagged far behind. And those countries that were lagging far behind, we were told that aid was going into these countries to help in all those areas where state funds couldn't provide for the people. Yet, as I say, philanthropic capital still highly contentious, not sure if it's delivered the socio-economic outcomes it was supposed to. So you reach that interesting point that where then, in what circumstance, public, private, then the money really reach the people that it's supposed to. So then we can't be surprised that the continent really hasn't developed. But we also don't know who is behind setting certain agendas, and I think that's the most important part. If you look at what's happened in the Sahel region, Burkina Faso being an example, that's an example of what you get when civilians decide we're going to just do it on our own, and look at the pace in which they've moved, right? Versus, yes, we would love to come together as a global community and have similar objectives and align and be progressive and move together. But if that's not happening, I think that there needs to be a few more questions asked. Perhaps you need to look at it a bit differently. Perhaps you need to think, how can we deploy capital in different ways? How can we as people get involved? Because at the end of the day, we stay here. And that's one point I would to highlight now, I guess, is stakeholders who don't really have proximity to the continent have been the ones setting the agenda, have been the ones at the tables deploying the capital, but aren't the ones who are actually living on the continent. And for me, I think that's probably why the debt crisis has arisen. You know, if I am living in a certain place, I'm the one that understands the deficiencies, the local needs, the needs of the people, whether it be in healthcare, in education, in the lack of infrastructure. Yet you have people setting agendas at a global level that it may look different. And I always like to draw comparisons, you know, within the UK, the US, Australia, South Africa, China, because you can see that what matters to one country doesn't necessarily matter to another country. How one country can industrialize overnight in one sector, another country cannot then just follow suit. You have to consider the bespoke features of that particular country. But that would mean you would need to give autonomy to the stakeholders in that country who understand the local needs of the people. And then they set the agenda for how capital is going to be deployed. Because I think for as long as the tables where capital is being deployed still look the same, you're never going to understand the local context, the nuances of the people, the needs of the people are not going to be met until you've got the right stakeholders directing capital. But as I've mentioned, philanthropy, some people are saying it's been gangsters' paradise. Funds were used for nefarious means. I don't know. On the other side, these loans were getting signed. Do we see evidence of this infrastructure? I don't think so. Do we see evidence of healthcare facilities being built? I don't think so. But then we look at Burkina Faso and then the pace at which the Sahel region is moving, and then you think to yourself, does it really work for us to have so many stakeholders and us moving in unison, or do we retreat back into all of our local markets, come together as local communities, determine what are our priority areas, or roll up our sleeves and make things better for the region and for ourselves as a community living there? To my mind, I think that makes sense. And that is exactly what we're beginning to see on the continent. And I only suspect that we're going to see more of that. I'm not suggesting that, certain regions that are still in a highly neoliberal state, I don't think that we're going to see much progress in those regions soon enough. But you never know. I think, as I said, people are beginning to ask more questions because you can't have an extended period of time where people's lives really haven't changed, especially where you've had generous people, high network individuals put up their hands wanting to deploy capital. Some have deployed capital, but it hasn't been used for what it was supposed to use. It hasn't been used to progress the people and advance the continent. So I think that the future of philanthropy will be more, I did almost said a hybrid. Well, I mean, impact investing is sort of a hybrid of debt financing and philanthropy, because in debt financing, banks are not going to just, wake up and give you money because you're you, right? There's extensive checks there are extensive checks that happen. And, during my time as a finance lawyer, these are all the compliance elements that you're involved in, right? Where you need to make sure that all the requisite funding documents are in place. So the bank is not going to fund unless you've got your resolutions. As in, has this been decided by the board that this is the money that needs to be procured? This is the purpose which the money is going to be used for. There's so many checks and balances. Whereas in philanthropy, it was a lot. It wasn't as stringent as when you look at traditional finance. In philanthropy, you would have people deploying large amounts of capital for good. And I think for me coming into philanthropy, it was interesting when people would say that, oh, we're just giving this money because we like the cause. And I'm, as a, coming from the debt side, I'm asking more questions like, is the course being advanced? How do you know? Do you have metrics? Are you measuring? Are you getting feedback? Are you, I have way more questions to ask other than I'm giving this money just because I can. So what we're now going to see on the philanthropy side is some of the checks and balances that you've had on the debt financing side are now going to be coming into philanthropy, where your your investors are going to be asking more questions. And another factor that's influencing how philanthropic capital is changing is because you've got people in the private equity and venture capital space wanting to come onto the continent and invest as alternative finances to traditional lending. Because in everything I've spoken about these global finance, those were all traditional lending institutions. And I must say that there are many people that are very skeptical of those institutions. I was in one platform where somebody, I think to me, it's still stuck to my mind today, said, we've had so many development institutions on the continent. If they were doing their work, then why isn't the continent developed? And I was like, whoa, hectic. But there's truth in that. I think that there's, multiple truths can exist. I'm not going to be taken away from poor governance, but at the same time, we can't have the conversation about poor governance without having the conversation about Africa still being in a neoliberal state. If really Africa was free to determine her own future, decide how she's going to use the funds for her own people, I don't think things would look how they look. Some of this, I think, has been done strategically, but we never really know behind the veil. We never really know what exactly is happening. But as I say, I am only interested in have the lives of people improved and what is the lived experience and what is people's perception of everything that's happening around them and how is that influencing their lived experiences. So yeah, just to wrap up on the changes when it comes to philanthropic capital, I think we're going to have a lot more scrutiny, but also it comes with so much more opportunity because where you have people who've come from traditional lending, debt financing, coming into philanthropic capital, you have a real opportunity to now fund in thematic areas. So I've seen amazing examples of some funds who are in gender lens financing, for example, and those are the ones that are maybe going to finance women-owned businesses or fund GBV initiatives. However, they're not just funding because they like women or they like GBV. Now they need certain outcomes, milestones, how that's going to be monitored, how exactly you're going to deliver. So before you get access to that capital in the way that you wouldn't get access to capital from a traditional lending institution, it's going to be the same where it's coming from a nonprofit, a PEVC, and these alternative funders and investors that we're now going to be seeing coming onto the continent. So one positive thing about the African debt crisis, it's like any other crisis. Where there's a crisis, there's always an opportunity. I love to believe that. That's been my experience. Where a heightened crisis, it's always a heightened opportunity always arises. So I think that perhaps we haven't really analyzed the continent in this way. Perhaps we haven't considered specific opportunities that can arise in the current climate. So I think that that's why a lot of people are rushing now to set up on the continent because they've realized that actually there's so much more scope. One of the benefits of the continent is that we don't have so many legacy structures. I mean, I'm just going to make an example of healthcare. I know that for many people, they'll believe that, the continent needs more financing into healthcare. Be that as it may, having the structures of healthcare as they currently are more integrated, as in you've got your community structures in place because there isn't really access to a public facility. The hybrid structure, I think, works better than if you look at a country like the US and in the UK. Those healthcare systems are reactive systems. They were built for reaction, as in, you get really sick and then you go to the hospital. Whereas if you look at an emerging market like India, the healthcare system is actually optimized for health. So the whole country in itself, from the Ministry of Health, is all about preventative health because they don't really want to deploy the public funds into developing a healthcare system when you can mitigate people getting sick in the first place by encouraging all of these preventative healthcare remedies and measures be put in place to avoid people having to now rely on state facilities. So for me, I think that the continent determining her own agenda is important because we don't have legacy structures, but it also doesn't mean that we need to go and replicate Western structures that, I mean, I think it's safe to say that are collapsing. I mean, anyone who's read up about the NHS, you know that it's collapsing. The US healthcare system is collapsing. Like, if you don't have private care, you may not make it. You may not necessarily make it. So This is why I think localization and having those bespoke developmental plans matter, not just replicating every playbook. And also, in the advancements of technology, if you are going to implement any healthcare facility onto the continent, the great thing is because you don't have those legacy structures, you're starting at such an advanced position, right? Which means that your diagnostics are going to be a lot quicker. But can you imagine if we have a combination of the two? Preventative healthcare, drawing on the India example, and then here you've got diagnostics. It can only mean that the healthcare system is going to be a lot more efficient. But you can already tell in what I'm describing, this is something that hasn't been done before, and I think that's what we need to be focusing on. And it's important. Why? Because that's what sets the funding agenda. We can't be calling for more capital on the continent just so because we want to replicate Western models that are already collapsing. For me, that makes no sense. What makes more sense to me is that, yes, there must be calls for more capital to be mobilized and deployed. However, its deployment must be in areas that are innovative and that are going to sustain um, not only just the economy, but also the people themselves. Meaning that let's lean into things that promote longevity and things like preventative care. They do that. We cannot just rush to invest and fund a reactive healthcare system, which we know doesn't necessarily work. Okay, so I guess my last point before closing this out is I know some people are thinking, why the emphasis on Africa all of a sudden? I mean, as an African, it doesn't feel like all of a sudden for me, right? I mean, I lived on the continent for a majority of my life, so I will always look at it differently. However, I'm in a capitalist country, so I sort of have tried to understand how capitalists think. And from a consumerist perspective, it is estimated, I think, in 2050, 1 in 4 people will be living on the continent and they'll be African. The youngest demographic in the world is on the continent. So anybody who's developing a product or service wants to get closer to the consumer. And you don't get close to your consumer when it's time to get close to your consumer. Of course, you'll want to understand the lay of the land, your market niche, and segment your play and segment the market and then establish your place in that particular market well in advance. So with the way that let me say with the current projections of how the continent will develop, it would make sense that there is this focus on the continent. I cannot speak too much about the stagnant growth of the Western markets. I think that that is a very technical economic argument. However, I do find it interesting that people are saying, the metrics that we use are never going to get, always are promoting growth, profits growing every year, and that's not really optimum for the economy. Hence why, like, your Western economies have sort of stagnated, because I mean there's only so much you can go up, right? You can say to people, okay, next year will go up by 4%, but you cannot, like, to expect that the growth will happen at that rate year on year and year out, I think is unrealistic. And that's what my understanding is what's happened in the West. But also, I think late stage capitalism is real. The impact of AI and automation technology, I think, is what has impacted the West the most and why the economy stagnated. But as I say, I'm not really an expert in it. Just thought it's worth mentioning because it's always interesting to parallel the two and draw the lessons from Western capitalism and what's worked and what hasn't worked. Because as I said, I don't think if we're really invested in advancing the continent that we should copy paste exactly the same playbook. I think we can learn from it and then we can localize and just and set the agenda on what is it that we're going to improve and how we're going to make sure that the continent remains sustainable. So yeah, I think that's it from me. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye.